You mean disruption of authoritarianism?
Yes.
I think that we started there. When I said, that this whole design is to create an ecosystem that uproots, big banks, big tech, and big state. Like that, everything I do, everything we're doing, all of our designs are trying to do that. And so if that's your bag, well, then we've got something for you. It will take us some time to deliver the ecosystem and all the parts of it, but that is the plan. The plan is to make it so you could entirely opt out of that system. Now, does the atomic economy solve violence? No. I think that the best we can do, and my theory behind all of this is, if I can make it so everybody has everything they need, if they chose to actually focus on aligning incentives, and no matter how different those incentives are and how varied they may be, if they have some way of finding each other, people that agree with each other, finding each other, then maybe there could be a minimum amount of violence.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Changing the Tide. I'm your host, John Crabtree. Today, I have the pleasure of having a conversation with John Carvalho, CEO of Synonym, and that is a company that is looking to build for the hyberbitcoinized economy, the atomic economy, and they have released quite a few products into the wild since their initial unveiling at Adopting Bitcoin in El Salvador last fall. Let's talk to John. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Excited to have you. We're going to dive into the Clark Moody Bitcoin dashboard. Quite a bit going on today in the markets.
Something happened today?
Just a absolute carnage. No, but I know you have some thoughts as well, because when it comes down to it, you've got some ideas of when the bear market is finally going to end. But we are at a price of you can exchange $31,320 US for a full Bitcoin at the moment. And we have block height. We're starting at block height 735,644 with a chain size of about 460 gigabytes. We've got 15,563 reachable Bitcoin nodes, and 8,476 of those are on Tor. And interestingly enough, I was seeing one of Synonym's recent tweets that Blocktank, your new LSP, supports Tor, so that's exciting. Probably more relevant for Lightning Network, total nodes 16,968, and that means there's about 3,768.77 Bitcoin at work in the Lightning Network. And so still pretty good fees. They have gone up pretty significantly lately, but that is the stats for now. And John, let's talk about Synonym. Can you tell people the high-level overview?
So Synonym is a company that is basically trying to create an ecosystem that assumes hyperbitcoinization. Basically, if we as Bitcoiners are right that the world will end up, having Bitcoin be the primary store value asset, what does that mean if all the rest of it comes true? In other words, governments become, unable to leverage fiat as a way of, enforcing their monopolies. Big banks go away. Big tech becomes, undermined, etc. So monopolies generally are, theoretically less likely, and there's more competition. What do we replace those things with? And so Synonym is trying to create a minimum set of applications and protocols that would enable such a future to be able to exist and be able to replace the legacy economy with this new, what we call atomic economy.
And that's going to not require, from what it looks like, big tech, big banks, big everything else.
Yeah. Big techs, big banks, and I guess big state, you could say. But yeah, so the idea is to, what do we replace each of those things with as a, community, as an economy, and what does it actually look like to not have, all of that stuff in place? And how do people actually practically interact with each other when hosting things themselves or holding their own assets, and how do we have capitalism, and how do we deal with credit and things like this when we don't have those major institutions to rely on and kind of enslave us, depending on how you look at it.
That was one of the interesting things I noticed is there aren't a lot of voices out there advocating for the need for credit in a hyper-Bitcoinized world. But you sent out a tweet, it might have been a week or 2 weeks ago, talking about how Bitcoin probably, because it really has never been this way, it probably won't be the only form of medium of exchange in the future, and that people will probably still need credit. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, as part of the mission to kind of, actually be realistic and rational about such a future, I ended up, I went into a rabbit hole for a few months trying to model how this would actually work. Like what would we use? How would we interact, et cetera, like I was saying. And one thing that I learned while at BitRefill, or at least learned more deeply, is how people use gift cards as alternative money and as another way of kind of operating within society, both people getting paid in gift cards, people overcoming, problems that they have with borders or regulations or whatever it may be. Like, I just saw so many stupid little hacks that people were doing with gift cards just to be able to do the things like non-criminal things, just normal things they want to be able to do, but because they live in a different country than what they're trying to do, than the business that, is providing the service, that they have various gaps to overcome. And so that was one side that I saw. And another is just the concept of trust. Like, everything is trusted. Everything we do is, there's trust involved in one way or another when you have more than one person. And so because digital society, the internet can't enforce anything in the real world in any meaningful way, you have to figure out how you deal with that. And so how do you do things like finance the accelerated growth of your business? Like, you need somebody to trust you. You need somebody that you trust. You need some form of credit. You need some form of method of using other people's money. And because Bitcoin is, a bearer instrument, you don't really want to have to trust everybody by loaning them Bitcoin, because that essentially involves giving them Bitcoin. And while you could establish reputation to make you more trustworthy to do that, Bitcoin is more, appropriate, in my opinion, as the root store of value, and maybe less appropriate for something like credit and something like, your hot money, the money that you spend every month, the money that you are interacting with in a risky way. If it's a high time preference money, I guess you could say, it doesn't necessarily need to be Bitcoin. And Bitcoin theoretically will also become very expensive to move, and so you're not really going to want to frequently transact it. Block space is limited. Bitcoin, as it's designed, and any blockchain really, can't really support an entire society of people holding their own keys and sending their own transactions, constantly all day. And so how do we scale Bitcoin? How do we scale the social layer on top of, the economy, and the economic layer on top of Bitcoin? Because even Lightning eventually won't be enough, theoretically. And so when you combine all of these things, you realize that credit is probably never going to go away. Lesser forms of money, like bearer instruments, will probably never go away. And just, another thing I said in the tweet is that it's pretty likely that people just always want at least one alternative. They might say, hey, you know what? I don't trust that Bitcoin thing. I trust my government fiat. And then fiat lives way longer than we want it to, just because some people don't trust the technology, or people don't the interactions of what they have to the trade-offs are. Maybe they just would rather trust. We're not going to be able to take that away from people just because Bitcoin is better. And so I think that there'll always be alternatives. I envision and think that credit is probably the best alternative, as far as if you want to have a paradigm where you're having multiple monies. I would consider, okay, who do I trust? Is the first question that you need to answer, and what am I using to measure that trust? And that's why we have work that we're putting into webs of trust in our Slashtags protocol work. And so I just want to give everybody the tools that they need to be informed and to be able to decide who they can trust the most with the right situation that they're, applying that trust for. And so I would rather, like, for example, have credit with Starbucks for my coffee, if that's where I spend my money on coffee, then I always have to make a Bitcoin transaction every time I buy coffee, or even monthly. At some point, some amount of batching for efficiency is required. So I don't really think that I'm not going to worry if Starbucks goes out of business with my, $100 of credit that I have with them. It's a small concern, and that $100 of credit will last me some months. So why not keep my credit with Starbucks at least in a bearer instrument asset, like a token, that I can easily unload and trade with any other peer rather than only redeem it with Starbucks. Maybe even other coffee companies want to accept the Starbucks token because it's a bearer instrument, so any type of aftermarket could exist. So you could have literally order books of credit tokens where you can have supply and demand, be a market-driven thing, and thus anybody could accept any form of money, and the concept of a kind of unit of account kind of just goes out the window because everything is already digitized and you can automate the pricing of anything and price in anything you want.
Wow,
that's a little bit of a rant. Sorry.
That's ambitious. Couple follow-ups there. That's really interesting. The idea of, I guess I never thought about how much credit exists just in the gift card industry alone.
It's billions of dollars. I don't remember the last statistic. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I'm going to guess, somewhere in $3 to $5 billion range, but I'm not sure. I really could be misquoting that.
And what's incredible about that for businesses is that they're able to, if those gift cards are not redeemed right out of the gate, they're able to use that money on the back end until such time as that's redeemed. And so they could be using it to build out the business further and that sort of thing. And so
exactly. So like, for example, say I have a coffee shop and I have enough business to like make some profit and pay my employees and maybe, make some savings for myself, but I don't have enough to open a second coffee shop. Well, maybe one way that I can get an edge is to sell credit for that new coffee shop at a discount and say, okay, look, I'm going to profit share indirectly with the people that like my coffee shop and would like to have a location near them, and offer, say, a 5% discount on the credit, which is essentially an eating into of the future profits to get 5% more income out of it, so I can kind of get an edge in this way. Now, granted, the math probably doesn't work out perfectly in that example, and you probably need a lot more than 5% to do anything at an aggressive pace, but it's just the idea that you can kind of use your own reputation and kind of design your own discounting, and this way you don't have to do equity, and you don't have to do traditional bank or big bank loans and this kind of, or rely on fiat, etc.
Okay, awesome. There's a lot to unpack in that, but I want to dive right into Slashtags and that protocol in terms of webs of trust. And interestingly enough, I think it has a lot to do with decentralized identification. Is that a good?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I want to let you finish your question. I don't
yeah.
Interrupt.
So,
is that the whole question?
Well, actually, it's more along something that you and I were DMing about that I noticed over on LinkedIn from Cash App. There's a compliance person there. And this was talking about decentralized identification. And the option being you have the wallet of all your possible IDs and you can just slide the government's forms of identification in there. And I asked you, that can't be what you guys are thinking about in terms of like the ability to control your reputation and use tools on top of your reputation. So I guess it's less of a question and more of a comment, and I'd love for you to respond.
Sure. I'll say that, like, we didn't call it an identity system, and that was very, very intentional. And as we created Slashtags and its features and all the things that it does, we saw that it's actually much, much more powerful than simply making IDs digital. Like, and I feel like the industry for decentralized identity is basically like riddled with failure. Its influence is mostly, and when I say riddled with failure, I mean this is an industry and a tech that has been trying to get off the ground for years, a long time, and nothing has ever kind of broken through. And even when we had, there was a lot of waves being made by Microsoft's Ion, back, I guess this is maybe 5 years ago now, roughly, that came on the scene. That went nowhere either. And so no matter which angle you took, even Web3 right now, like any success that it's having is based on the Ponzi aspect of adding a token to it, not the utility. There's been some success, for example, with like MetaMask using authentication inside of their wallet, and using keys for this. But this is mostly, it has a carrot in front of that where people are just using it because it's the only option they have to be able to gamble and participate in some of these Ponzi's. And so when you remove all that and you say, okay, like, is this really just about identity or really just about IDs? And it's like, no, this is a really dystopian way to look at this technology. And I didn't want to, we intentionally called it Slashtags because we didn't want to give it a name that had ID in it. Like, you could have things called like truth ID and blah, blah, blah ID, and, plays on the word identity. And I was just, I can't do that, because while you could make any type of identity system with this method and with Slashtags, and while you could imagine any type of ID, use case that you want to and apply it here, that is just one subset of things that you can do when you build the whole entire web out of keys instead of building it the way that we do now with accounts and web servers. And so we wanted to make sure when people thought about Slashtags, they didn't think about the identity thing as the only narrow part of the spectrum, that they thought about this tagging aspect, and basically this associating metadata with things. And so Slashtag actually is a pre-existing concept that we're kind of reimagining. It used to be a term that people would use for like when you have a category in a website and a URL, and you would have the category kind of reflect almost like a search term within that website. So if you did like Google/news, it would show you everything in Google's database that was tagged as news. Now, of course, Google News is actually a website, and it's a curated thing. But the idea is to kind of build on that idea. And so Slashtags is a way of applying, using key pairs as an anchor for everything and any type of metadata, and basically a way to abstract, peers into a key. And there are a lot more use cases that you can do than simply identity. Like, for example, Slashtags right now, we're working on an SDK to make it easier for people to use and use within their products. And we're currently implementing it in our products. We haven't released our mobile wallet yet or much news about it, but that's what we're doing right now, is implementing it there. And we'll show how you can use Slashtags for website accounts, how you can use it for data feeds from the website accounts, sort of like an API key, for contacts, and for, what was the other thing? Profiles, and Slashpay. And Slashpay is a good example of how, this has much more power than identity, because Slashpay is a way of abstracting payments and payment negotiation. And so what we'll do is we'll show how you can basically, behind Slashtags, you can have a whole set of preferences and different payment methods you support, and you can automatically, match these payment methods with a peer when you're trying to pay them. So instead of simply saying, hey, show me a Lightning invoice, you could show me basically a Slashpay invoice that could include the ability to pay me with Lightning, with on-chain Bitcoin, with legacy SegWit, native SegWit, Taproot. It can include all the different payment methods and automatically handle whichever method you prefer. And so this is just a way of using abstraction that Slashtags can provide to do a lot more than just identity.
So Slashtags not only deals with kind of who
I didn't even get into the Web of Trust stuff,
yeah.
Sorry, but that's another dimension as well.
Yeah, go ahead, get into it.
So I left that part out, but basically when I mentioned rebuild the entire web this way, that's what I'm getting at, is if everybody is a key, and every server is a key, and every file can be represented as a key, and you can basically anchor metadata to these keys, that metadata is essentially can be represented as a schema. And that schema is basically a way of defining a network. It's a way of saying, it's also a way of defining like almost like a search algorithm, or it's a topic, and you can define how it's defined, and you can do so mutually with other people, and you can basically create these like fractal networks, or these kind of multi-dimensional networks out of this, that you can kind of peer with people over topics. And these topics can be extremely abstracted and have multiple like dimensions to them. So the 3 dimensions that we talk about are basically the topic or the category, and then you have like the range or the score, like how much to what degree the thing is, and then you have the access control. What permissions are required in order, what level of trust is required to be able to have access to a thing. And so if you use these dimensions, the topic, the range, and the permissioning, then you can kind of control pretty much anything to do with data within any network. And you can do this from the perspective of the user, and the user can change their perspectives based on how they weight each of these things. And so the examples I could give would be like, all right, categories for movies. So you have a schema for movies, for rating movies, for selling movies, for curating movie files, whatever it may be, and you can list out all the different metadata that's associated with a movie, and then you can score each aspect of the metadata, and you can even establish permissions based on the metadata. So you can say, okay, if you are somebody that likes horror movies, then now you're in the horror movie network, and you can message people that like horror movies, or you can, rate horror movies or only search for horror movies. But it's kind of a way of breaking down the algorithm, like a Google search algorithm, and putting it like into pieces into each user's hands to how they filter things, the information that they have. And so you can use these things not only for categorization, but like to define application data. And so you can say, okay, this is a schema for Twitter, or a social network like Twitter. And so here's how you construct a tweet. Here's how you reply to a tweet. Here's the topic. Here's all the break down all the pieces of a tweet, just like you would in a centralized database, except everybody can use the same format as you. And you can now either choose to download all the tweets from all of your peers, or you can choose to upload them to another peer so they can serve it for you. And all these schemes, like we pair Slashtags with a technology called Hypercore, and Hypercore is handling the storage and the networking aspects of things. But basically, Hypercores are like BitTorrents, except the files are made out of append-only logs, and those files are also represented as keys. And so you can have an entire file system inside of the log, and the log has integrity because it's sequential, like you can only add things to it. And so thus anybody can serve it. And you can encrypt these logs, so you can choose which keys can write into the log and which keys can't. So you can kind of serve things for other people without being able to manipulate them necessarily, unless you have permission to do so.
Sounds familiar.
And so you can kind of reconstruct the whole web out of this in a way that becomes interoperable and relative to like only what you care about.
Wow. So when you came up with Synonym over the past couple of years, I mean, this is like, I don't want to call it a full-on assault, but this is we could redo the web completely.
That's the plan. Yeah. Originally I wanted to do a presentation when we announced the company, and I had like 3 sections, and it was like, how do we, I forget what I ended up saying, but the original titles were fuck big banks, fuck big state, fuck big tech. And it was how we were going to fuck each one of them. But legal didn't want me to say that. They probably won't hear this, hopefully, but they probably wouldn't want me to say it here either. Because, we are a compliant business, and we're not trying to break laws. We're just trying to show how you can build a society that doesn't require these structures.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think through Bitcoin and how it's a pseudonymous network. And so I think there's always been from the very beginning, I guess from the very beginning of the network, it's been very much about how much privacy you give away versus how much you like retain. And so in a way, like Slashtags, is it in the same way, very trying to be pseudonymous and allow you to share as much or as little as you want? Um, am I off in this question? Is it not really applicable?
No, you're much more on than most people, honestly. That is exactly my definition of privacy. Privacy is metadata, and privacy is deciding who to give metadata to, who to expose your actions to. And so I only believe you can lose privacy. I don't think you can gain privacy. And so this is why I'm not a big fan of the kind of current trends in privacy, like with doing mixing and, just the security through obscurity, making a lot of metadata and trying to hide within it, because this type of metadata is very easy to unravel. And I believe that they are unraveling it, blockchain analysts and things like this, and that even if you make it hard for them, they eventually becomes very, very easy as time passes, because more and more metadata gets revealed. And so eventually they can dedupe things, and they learn, oh, this portion of the data now we are sure is this person or these people, and you're just not left with very much mystery in the end. And so, yeah, I think that Slashtags is a way of abstracting data. And so as long as we design good, best practices for how to employ these methods, I think, and people use those methods and continue to improve on them, that it is going to be a way for you to for data to be local first, and for your actions to be local first, and for you to have the best information possible with whom to trust with sharing your metadata with, and whom to have host your data, whom to have to do business with, etc. And so it will be tricky, and it will take time to make good user experiences, and make sure people respect that what's going on here, and not combine all their identities or do things that are poor practice. But I do think it is the only way to improve on the situation that we have, where we have a few major companies basically farming all of our data and knowing everything about us. I mean, we're pretty passive about it now, but even myself, somebody that thinks about this stuff, like, I give way too much information. Like, we have Twitter. You and I are DMing on Twitter and emailing each other on Gmail. And, they have, both those two companies have so much data about other behaviors that we're doing, that they could know everything about us. So, like, if we were meeting for coffee tomorrow, they would probably know about it. Like, it's like there's just way too much, control, and way too much trust that we're giving these people. And it doesn't really have to be that way at all.
Yeah. Okay. That's powerful.
Yeah. I hope so. We'll see.
we shall see, if accomplished, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So then, with that, one of the things that came to mind is Noster or Noster. Are you familiar with that project?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a competitive project to that? Could it potentially be built on Noster, be built on top of Slashtags? I don't know.
Yes, no. The thing about when you're doing abstracting data and abstracting metadata and trying to make, these new types of key-based web, user experiences, I actually believe that we're all going to end up converging on one design. And I would say that our approach is, we're trying to be, very thoughtful and methodical about what that design will end up being and the best way to create that design. And we're trying to do that. We're trying to basically zoom all the way out and say, if you make everything as abstracted as possible, what are the important primitives? How do you build on top of those primitives? How do you demonstrate those within applications and keep layering things on? Something like Noster is taking like a subset of that strategy and saying, let's just make this now and cut all the corners just so we can make this one thing. Now, their strategy tends to work. Historically, just shipping something tends to work better than, being meticulously trying to perfect something. And so I'm not going to say they're doing the wrong thing or the right thing, so much as they're taking a different path than we are. I don't think Noster has plans to do what we just discussed for the past 10, 15 minutes. Like, they're not trying to do that. But in a roundabout way, they are, and they just don't know it yet. And so this has been a trend. Like, for example, the same people working on that worked on LNURL, and LNURL turned into another subset of features of things that Slashtag solves. But it ended up kind of in a certain corner of reality and only doing that subset. And so LNURL auth, for example, is a way to log into a website using a key, but that's all it does. And they ended up adding some other LNURL features for withdrawing and these kinds of things, but they're disassociated, and you can't really do because they were created like one at a time as necessary. There's no cohesion to how all these things work together. And so you can't do some of the powerful things that you could do like by making an account with a Slashtags key, like having a data feed that's encrypted coming from the website and having what cool user experiences that creates inside of wallets, with having it be a way to manage your contacts and having a way to do, say, encrypted peer-to-peer messaging. And if you do it the right way, you can end up doing all the things. And that's what we're trying to show, is that one thing at a time, prioritizing the primitives first. That if we're going to rebuild the web, let's do it all at once and correctly. Maybe we'll be wrong, and maybe we'll miss something. Maybe we'll be too slow, and something in between will win before us. But our plan is to kind of build all the pieces first, and then we also will try to tackle building a social media product late this year into next year, probably, if necessary. If by then, Noster figures it all out and we can just combine Slashtags with Noster and have the same experience, then that's what we'll do. I'm not looking to double work for no reason. It will only do our vision if nobody else is doing it already. You also have Blue Sky trying to do similar things that they were funded by Jack and Twitter when he was there. They're a separate entity now, but they recently released a protocol that is somewhat solving a spectrum of the things that Slashtags is trying to do as well. But they have more of a design interest in making moderation possible. And that's something that I don't have a lot of interest in. Now, are they right that that's going to be a required thing? I'm skeptical, but who knows? My opinion, it will pollute the design and make the design inferior. But they're not done yet, and they may come to the same realizations that I've come to and try to handle it differently. So I don't know how the future will play out, but I am confident that in a way we are all converging on the same design, because what we're all trying to do is find the simplest, most efficient way to get everybody to connect with each other and control how those connections behave.
Yeah, and I think that point is interesting and probably moves us into the next part of the conversation around Blocktank. I was just re-listening, I should say. I didn't get to listen to the whole thing when you guys did it, but your spaces with Roy at Breeze. And he was actually talking about LNURL and in that. And so I guess the interesting thing here, John, that I want to talk about is you, and bridging in something else in, you run the Biz, is it the Biz Bitcoin podcast or the Biz BTC?
It's called the Biz, technically it's called the Biz with John Carvalho. It's called this for legal reasons because there are other bizes. But yeah, it's the biz.pro is the website.
So, and go to biz.pro and contribute to the next one, listen to the previous ones. But you had one in there with Junseth, and you guys were talking about how there's, early in Bitcoin, it was like, I have to create a business that is Bitcoin focused. And what you guys talked about in that episode was actually, you just need to create a business and accept Bitcoin for payments and, for goods and services. And so that's what I think I'm pretty stoked about with Blocktank is you have Blocktank, but then you also have Blocktank Hub, which sounds like it's going to be more focused for larger businesses. So could you talk about Blocktank?
Sure. So to recap, the topic with Junseth was just about, I believe the question was, what is a Bitcoin business? And he was trying to point out that you're not a Bitcoin business just because you accept Bitcoin as a payment method. And just because you want Bitcoin to succeed doesn't mean you have to find weird, ways to include Bitcoin in your business plan. In other words, if your job is not to create Bitcoin wallets, then you shouldn't really be worrying that much about being a quote unquote Bitcoin business. Like that's for if you want to sell Bitcoin to people or you want to provide Bitcoin connectivity to people. That's about probably the spectrum of Bitcoin business. Like you're not going to make money by contributing to Bitcoin Core. You're not going to make money by making totally open source software that has no profit plan. That's not a thing. It's not a good premise to go into. And back then, in the early days, a lot of people were doing this, and everybody thought there would be a Bitcoin version of every business. And while that can sort of be true if every business accepts Bitcoin, that's about the extent of it. So with Blocktank, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take this concept of an LSP, sort of like an ISP, where you have your internet service provider that helps you connect to the internet. LSPs are Lightning service providers that help you connect to the Lightning Network. And the idea here is that the Lightning Network is a great way to enable Bitcoin to be, practical and a good user experience for commerce. So for merchants and for consumers trying to make payments to each other, the Lightning Network makes that more practical because it behaves in an instant way, and you can do like a high frequency of payments for lower cost than you could on chain. And so the idea is that because of the design of the Lightning Network requiring like this liquidity concept and routing and channels and being basically a little more high tech than people might be used to, a Lightning service provider is a way to kind of remove a lot of the necessities of that from the user's wallet and put them on a server and allow the user to kind of connect to the server as its entry point into the Lightning Network, much like an ISP would. And so Blocktank is a whole suite of features and applications and services that we have open sourced, so anybody could run an LSP service. And we are now an instance of that. And you'll see this with pretty much all the stuff that we create at Synonym, where we are trying to both like be the reference business and the reference implementation of the software, but open sourcing the software and saying, now you do it. Anybody can do it. And so all of our stuff is open source, MIT open source, everybody can use it. And it's kind of rare, actually, in the case of Blocktank, where we open source the server from the day of launch.
Wow.
A lot of times people will either never open source the server, not fully open source the server, or put a different license on the server, these kinds of things. And so we kind of are treating it like a hybrid, almost like a FOSS project, where anybody could use it and anybody could contribute to it, but also we are a business running it and deploying it. And so Blocktank provides, the ability to buy channels, customizing, both the remote and the local balance, how much you can receive, how much you can spend, and also customize how long you want the commitment to be from us to keep that channel open. And we have various mechanisms in place and tools for like letting anybody that runs an LSP be able to like customize the pricing, customize, the API to be able to customize the front end. So we've also released a web widget, which is like basically a web page version of an interface. So you can buy channels from this, and that's at blocktank.synonym.to. And that's also open source as well. So if anybody wants to run a widget, the Blocktank software has an API, so anybody could make any type of front end they want with it. And now because we've open sourced the server, we're also, trying to promote this concept of a Blocktank hub, which would be like a business that is trying to run Blocktank and an LSP node to provide connections directly to their own users. And so that business would be able to connect with us and rely on us for things like routing and liquidity on the majority of the network, but they would sell channels directly to their customers as a source of revenue and a way to like have a direct connection with their customers into one like sub hub, And so my vision for Lightning Network is that I think economically it needs to evolve as a network that is like hubs of hubs. And so you'll have kind of like LSPs and exchanges as like the kind of core set. And then you'll have merchants as like the next kind of ring outward. And all of these things will be connected and highly connected. But then users will not be highly connected. They will be like connected to maybe one or two hubs that they frequently transact with and rely on the hubs connections and routing for any type of unusual or rarer payments.
That's fascinating. So kind of a hub and spoke model. And is that
Right.
yeah,
Hubs and
hubs
spokes,
and
I
spokes?
guess. Yeah.
And is
But the problem is, like, when you say hub and spoke to people, they think, oh, it's centralized. And I'm saying, no, like, there'll be hundreds of hubs. It's just that you don't need the users to be hubs. The users shouldn't be thinking, I need to connect, I need to have 50 channels. No, that's not practical. The user wants to have as few channels as possible.
yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. But it's still decentralized, but maybe not as decentralized as like some people might think in terms of running 60 channels.
I think decentralized is like almost the wrong way to look at it because it's peer to peer, right? And so whether it's decentralized is basically how many people are in your network and how many of them are connected to one node in that network. And that's not really the same concept. Like, you can have multiple Lightning networks that are totally disconnected from each other that use the same protocol. You can have many Lightning networks connected to each other by one hub. You can have everybody connected to everybody. Like, the most decentralized version of Lightning Network would be a horrible Lightning Network. It would mean everybody connected to everybody, and it would take a real long time to figure out the best route. It would be really expensive to send payments. It'd be really expensive to have a connection to everybody. Like, you don't really want like maximum decentralization in a peer-to-peer network. Bitcoin is not a peer-to-peer network. It's like it spreads the block information peer-to-peer, but it's not like everybody. When you send somebody Bitcoin, you don't connect to them. So what you do is you broadcast it, and the miners broadcast it, and everybody gets the transaction. There's no peer-to-peer. When I send you money, I don't send it to you only. But Lightning Network is that way, and thus you can't decentralize it in any meaningful sense. And so it's okay. The worst thing that can happen is even if the most centralized version of Lightning Network is what it became, where there was literally one hub and everybody was connected to that hub, the biggest trade-offs would be privacy and disruption if that hub went down. But you wouldn't necessarily lose your Bitcoin. It would just be like a really shitty situation if that node closed all the channels at once, because the blocks would be full for a long time. People wouldn't be able to send money to each other. Like, that would be bad. So you need some distribution of these hubs and some, I guess, decentralization of the hubs. But it's not like decentralization is like a virtue or like a thing to like maximize with Lightning.
Yeah, you made that comment in another podcast I was listening to, Talking in Bits, and you've probably made it in many others, but the idea of like Lightning truly being peer to peer, whereas Bitcoin is more of a global network. And so does that kind of, when you say Lightning probably won't be enough, is that the kind of...
I can say it most certainly won't be enough.
Yeah, dive into that. Tell us why.
Well, the problem with blockchains is they don't scale. By design, they do not scale. By them being a global network, they are maximally redundant. And so thus everybody has to keep a copy of everything if they're going to participate on the network actively. And there are certain limitations in Bitcoin that really throttle things for practical reasons. And every blockchain would need to do this. It's just the design. That would make it very difficult to, say, open a lot of channels in a short amount of time. You can't like onboard 1 million people in Bitcoin in one day. You just can't do it. And you probably can't even onboard all of the people in the world into Bitcoin, because you won't be able to create enough UTXOs based off of how many people are hoarding Bitcoin. And so if the fees would start to become really high in order to have to draw out these UTXOs, and the price of Bitcoin would have to go really high. And maybe it will all solve itself, but in the end, if we don't figure out a problem for increasing the amount of users that can hold their own keys and quickly, then we will have sort of like a second-class citizen kind of thing, where you'll have like the elites that hold Bitcoin on chain and hold real Bitcoin, and then the kind of lower classes that hold, either semi-custodial Bitcoin, like they share a UTXO and have some sort of weird, trade-off with that UTXO. Lightning is an example of that, actually. Like, you have this channel with one other peer. When it's that situation, you can manage it because you can trust the other peer, And then if they try to misbehave, there's a punishment transaction, process that you can do to make it so they can't steal from you. But when you start adding more peers, the game gets complicated. If you start having the multi-party channel, now what happens if like two people collude against the third person, or if like you get these weird little games that happen, and the games get more complicated the more people you put in them, and the trade-offs become more costly, or like worse in user experience, etc. And so people say that the multi-party channel factories will solve everything, etc. But they're kind of downplaying the trade-offs, and so Lightning probably won't be enough for everybody. And if we're going to have trust in the systems, a lot of people are they're assuming that this will be this way, that there will be people that have to trust in order to use Bitcoin. And so you have like systems like Chami and Mints and Galoy, custodial, community wallets. Just a lot of people exploring these different ways of using multi-sig, etc. And so I don't really want to give up on that. But I guess my way of giving up or capitulating to that is the whole credit concept and tokens. I think that's one way to, like, if I have to trust someone, let me be able to choose who to trust specifically in a granular way. I don't really like the idea of having to trust somebody with my Bitcoin. I think I should at least be able to hold my Bitcoin, even if I only can afford to move it once every year or once every 5 years, or if I can only afford one channel to be able to spend. That might get us through at least our generation. I don't know, like I don't know where the math plays out and how fast adoption will be and where problems will start to happen, and what the price of creating an on-chain transaction will be in my lifetime. But this is at least partially an unsolved problem, and not one that Lightning totally solves, because Lightning does not scale users, it scales transactions. And so it assumes everybody will have the ability to open a channel. But that is not a solved problem. Everybody will not be able to open a channel anytime soon. So that's, the other hope is that technology advances fast enough to offset this problem, which would mean that like we can make the blocks bigger without having a negative impact on the amount of people that can run a node. So for example, if hard drive space became extremely cheap, and network bandwidth became extremely cheap, that such that like anybody in third world country could run a node even though the blocks were 50 megabytes, then maybe some of these problems could be pushed out a lot longer. But these are the trade-offs that we have to make with scaling Bitcoin. Scaling always comes at a cost.
Yeah, it does. Okay, I want to put a pin in that conversation and get to Tightrope, because that was another product, or I guess service, that you unveiled as well. And what does Tightrope allow for?
So Tightrope is something we released with the Blocktank suite, because we recognize that there are a lot of merchants and people running Lightning that need to run more than one node. And so, for example, I think like Bitfinex has maybe 3 or 4 nodes. And when you're running these nodes, you kind of have these special problems for your own like node farm, where you have to rebalance channels. And this is a way that you can automate that. So Tightrope basically is a way, it actually uses Hypercore, the technology I mentioned earlier, to kind of get these nodes to peer with each other outside of the Lightning network, and communicate with each other when they need to be paid by each other, and they pay each other automatically to reach a goal of like what amount of percentage should be in that channel. So if you say I want every channel at 50% all the time, anytime routes happen through your network, one of the other peers will rebalance itself to make the balance 50% again. And so it's kind of automating channel balancing. So that's why it's called Tightrope, because it's like a balancing act. But also it's something that we're going to extend to end users. And so we're going to add features with Slashtags to be able to do things like subscriptions. And so we're going to take this automation method and have it be not just trusted, but authenticated. And so this way, if I can prove, say, to the Tightrope network of nodes that I have subscribed to pay for being topped up to 50%, or something like this, or basically rebalance whenever my channel reaches 20%, or this kind of thing, then it will automatically rebalance me as well as an end user and keep my channel in balance, or top me up. Or also automatically be able to use Slashtags and what we call Slashpay to automatically provide the user with a cost that they can pay. And because the user trusts the Tightrope node, they can have an allocation of money that they will automatically pay without authorization. And so you can say, okay, if Blocktank asks me for up to $50 per month to top up my channel, just automatically pay it. And then the whole thing can be automated this way. And so there's no user interaction required if they've set that allocation in their wallet.
Wow. Okay. And then again, to kind of reiterate, Slashpay is going to match up the payment types, like you mentioned, legacy,
right,
SegWit,
right.
native SegWit, Taproot, the different.
This way, if the user, say, in their wallet only had Tether tokens and on-chain Bitcoin, but they needed to top up their top-up payment was due in their subscription, it would be okay because the two servers could negotiate with each other and say, oh, okay, you don't, pay, you can pay, you have on-chain Bitcoin, okay, here's an on-chain Bitcoin address to pay.
Okay, interesting. And maybe kind of dive into that a little bit too. You guys created the first ever Tether transaction on Lightning. I forget if it was beginning of last month or sometime in late March, but I don't know if it necessarily caused a ruckus, but a lot of people, were like, wait, what's the point of, a Tether on Lightning? And I think your response was very interesting because it essentially came down to, if I remember correctly, like you must not have gotten outside of your bubble to if you don't know why this is important. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that too? The importance of others.
So I guess there's kind of two dimensions to that answer that I gave. One is everything we talked about earlier with gift cards and credit. Just basically like, we've done a lot of thinking about the role of credit and the role of gift, and I've had a lot of experience witnessing the role of gift cards. And so when somebody asks, why is this important? I just think, okay, like all you have to do is like try it on, like give me the benefit of the doubt and you come up with an answer and think, you tell me why I think this might be important. And it shouldn't be that difficult. You think, okay, why would somebody want to do this? Well, what are the benefits of Lightning? What are the benefits of Bitcoin? Well, the benefits are that they're bearer instruments that I can like transact peer to peer. And the benefits of Lightning are that it allows me to scale this in a way that makes it instant and cheap to do at high frequency. Now, these are all qualities that have no difference in importance when you apply them to credit. And so why not, right? I think people are inclined to, be negative when it's Tether because people, there's a lot of FUD and there's a lot of concern about Tether being a big bank and having a lot of, dollars under their control and thus being like a problem. They think if Tether dies, Bitcoin will get hurt or something. But the thing is like nobody has to use Tether. Like if you don't trust them, don't use them. And that's true of all credit-based, products, whether they be gift cards, like, Amazon has, I don't know, probably hundreds of millions of dollars or, of gift card credit issued. Those people have no problem. Nobody's accusing Amazon of, maybe one day not fulfilling their credit promise. Michael Saylor has got a lot of credit and he's buying Bitcoin with it. And so, like people seem to be a little bit selective about when they're concerned about things. And the truth is that with credit, like nobody's forcing you to use it. And so I don't use Tether. I don't have a need to use Tether at the moment. And so I'm not going to worry about whether or not to trust Tether with tethers like USDT. And so the idea, the answer that I was giving them was because of that, basically saying one half of the answer is all the importance of credit and the importance of having it as a bearer instrument and part of the economy. And the other half is just the practicality of that. If Lightning scales Bitcoin, there's no reason that it can't also scale tokens. That was the thinking behind the answer.
Well, the way I thought about it was very interesting because that happened, and then the not long after, I think there was Lightning Labs announcement of Taro. And as I got thinking about both of these options, it got me to think about the idea of bringing more liquidity to Lightning, like just liquidity in general. It taps into new assets that can then be brought to express value on Bitcoin and Lightning. Is that kind of up the right alley? I mean, that was my answer when I was wading through this whole conversation.
It's up the right alley. I would say I don't want to get like too crazy about technology and not point out the trade-offs. And so, I've been researching getting Lightning tokens as a concept to exist, since I was at BitRefill, at least 3 years ago, maybe more now. And I went through a long journey of researching different things. I went through, RGB project and was with that for a year or two. We went through experimenting with Omni and OmniBolt, and we also researched Taro and gave some feedback on the design of that before the release. And I've had my eye on the pulse, my eye on all this, my finger on the pulse of all this for some time now, and it still remains to be proven that this is the best way to do this. And so, to mention the trade-off side is that the idea of putting a bunch of things on top of Bitcoin comes with a few risks. One is if the cost of Bitcoin transactions goes up high, like we were talking about earlier, if it becomes very expensive, it could become impractical to put, a abstracted asset on chain to even anchor to Bitcoin. In other words, even if you're only anchoring once in a while with Taro or only to make a channel with OmniBolt, like, yes, you have scaled compared to doing everything on chain. But just because you've done that doesn't mean it will be enough. It could run out of utility someday if, maybe I don't want to make a channel, an OmniBolt channel for my Tether tokens if it costs me $2,000 to do so. And then what? So that's one trade-off that people worry about and is valid. At the moment, I think it's okay, and so it's worth experimenting for sure. And then another one is none of these things there's no such thing as a Lightning token. Okay, even though that's what we've called them, and we say you'll notice that we say moving tokens on the Lightning network. That's actually what's kind of somewhat possible. And so even with Taro, for example, they have a narrative where they're saying that it operates at the edge of the Lightning network, but this is actually it has nothing to do with the Lightning network. Like, Taro is a new network. It's like kind of like Omni, where it's a way of abstracting and creating tokens on top of Bitcoin. And then what Lightning Labs plans to do is make the LND implementation be able to see the Taro network and to see these Taro transactions and provide exchange rates at that, and be able to understand how to swap these things in order to use Lightning to send value. And so the idea is it will be sort of something like Strike, where Strike right now is using Lightning Network to send dollar amounts, but they are holding the dollars in a centralized, custodial account and on both ends of the transaction. And so this is a way of kind of transmitting value over borders using Lightning, but reallocating it in a different asset on each end. And so you don't need a special technology to do that, as Strike has shown, right? You just need to be cooperating at both ends of the transaction. You either need to be on both ends yourself, or you need the other party at the other end to be able to convert the asset. And that will be true with Taro's design as well, where you will essentially need an exchange at the beginning and end of the route. And so they're not putting it on Lightning per se. Now, you could argue that OmniBolt is a bit more on Lightning because it's actually using the same exact method of Lightning to update the state, except it's making Omni transactions inside of a channel. And so when you make the channel, you make an on-chain transaction that's Omni compatible. And when you are transacting within the channel, you're making new Omni transactions that could be sent to the chain. So it's like a little bit more on Lightning. But the problem there is every asset becomes a new Lightning network, because you essentially, your channel contains Tether, for example, inside of it. And if you want to send Tether to another channel, to some other peer, there has to be a route of tethers to be able to send to that person. So now you have a kind of multi layers where each asset is another Lightning network. And so there are practicality issues there as well. So in the tarot design, you need exchanges, and you need, exchanging, and you need to be advertising these rates, and you have to worry about rates. And there are a bunch of problems there, because what if your token doesn't have a reliable exchange rate? What if it's a new token? What is the exchange rate? How do you transmit it if there's no exchange rate? How do you transmit it if it's very volatile? You have various issues there. And the same can be true, or similar problems could be true for Omnibolt, where what if you don't have a route? What if you have to what if the whole network is owned by Tether and it's literally just one hub with a bunch of spokes? How horrible is that? What if Tether goes down? Like, there are trade-offs here. And so I think that both methods work. And I think that there are trade-offs for each, but I don't think it's obvious that either one is better than the other. And I don't think it's obvious that either one is actually the optimal design. There still will be new designs. And so this is why you saw me recently, or maybe you didn't see, but some people saw, I sent a letter to the Lightning developers mailing list saying, I think that as Lightning Labs implements this capability, that they shouldn't do it specifically only for Tarot. It shouldn't be like a deep Tarot integration. It should just simply be make Tarot on one side of the work, and then make Lightning nodes be able to have these new capabilities of advertising an exchange rate for an asset. And so this way, you kind of are making it possible to put more than one token method, more than one asset layer into Lightning nodes that choose to participate. And even if you only do it at the edges, at least the edges could support any type of asset. It wouldn't necessarily only be ones that are compatible with Tarot. It could be Tarot, it could be Omni, it could even be altcoins, honestly. It could be fiat, it could be whatever. And so this way, Strike could use it as a method for advertising exchange rates for fiat that they hold in their accounts. You could use it for Tether. You could use it for Tether on Omni, Tether on Tarot, Tether on whatever. And so I think that this kind of thinking is what led me to making that email, because I'm a little bit worried that actually none of us have got it right yet. And I'm worried that right now it's being portrayed as if because Lightning Labs is popular, that their method is actually higher tech and has won, even though it isn't even released yet. And so that is a mistake, because it might actually be, as far as how it portrays in the user experience and applications and the practicality of like exchanges versus multiple Lightning networks, I really don't know. I couldn't tell you which one I think is quote unquote better. And so now I'm left to deciding, do I pick one or the other? Do I support both? Or do I now think more about things like Slashpay and abstracting all these things and staying out of it? And so I'm always trying to stay on top of how to deal with the situation. And I do think that like there's possibly some mistakes that could be made if we don't think this way.
In a way, it reminds me of some of the I don't want to call it controversy, but let's take Bolt 12, right? That core Lightning.
That was the inspiration for Slashpay.
Was it?
Yeah. It was the fight about Bolt 11 and Bolt 12, and between, you have Bolt 11, you have Bolt 12, you have. If you look at the announcement when we released the proof of concept for Slashpay, I made a version, a comic, edited the comic of that, the standards from XKCD.
Yeah.
This is the famous standards comic. And it's like, there's too many standards. Let's make a new standard. And so now there's one more standard. and so I think that Bitcoin is going to continue to have this problem. And I think that both Bolt 11 versus Bolt 12 versus AMP versus LNURL, it's the same problem as Tarot versus Omnibolt versus, shitcoins, whatever. It's just like there's always going to be all these things people want to do. And you're never, and if you're ever the person saying, okay, it's done, it's over, we won, this is the standard, then you're just going to be proven wrong next time somebody does something new. And so we have to I think we should just acknowledge this and abstract these problems, into another standard. But nonetheless, in other words, there should be layers of this. And so while there could be more than one Slashpay standard, I do think that it is worth wrapping in this problem into one standard and saying, look, instead of having to pick which thing and only support one thing, why don't we just make it so we don't have to pick and we just say which things we support? And then that way you can kind of abstract the problem into a set of problems.
Yeah, and so in that direction, then, but a little bit unrelated. There's a couple different ways to like come by liquidity, right? So Amboss recently released Magma. Lightning has had Pool for a while. Blockstream has liquidity ads. Like, are you guys more on the um, non-custodial side, like liquidity ads is, or would Blockstream be more? It doesn't seem custodial to me, the way you guys have built it.
So custodial is kind of the wrong word with some of this stuff. Like when I buy something from a merchant, it's not that that merchant has custody of my money. It's that I trust them to deliver the product they said they would. Custody, from a legal standpoint, as far as I know, is a specific thing where like you're providing holding assets as a service, and so like I hold the assets for you. That's a different legal and compliance situation than I owe you a product because you paid me. Or I owe you a service because you paid me. So just making that little distinction there. But I would say, yes, we are very anti-custody. We want you to hold. We want self-custody. We want you holding everything you can. We don't have cookies on our website. We don't have Google Analytics on our website. Like we don't want your data. Like we just do our best to not take your data. I don't want your data. I don't want your assets. I don't want your Bitcoin. I don't want your Tether. I don't want any of it. That said, there is a growing kind of so it's becoming apparent that with things like Magma, with things like Pool, with things like liquidity ads, and like websites like LN Router, PeerSwap, all these different tech related to balancing channels, selling channels, managing liquidity, that there needs to be some sort of either protocol between marketplaces or some sort of way to peer a universal marketplace. Now, I think Pool is trying to do that in some ways. And I don't know that obviously they did not succeed because not everybody is using Pool. The Magma exists. Island Router, liquidity ads exist. There has not been anybody gravitating towards one protocol and one method. So I think that the way we're going to handle it with Blocktank is we're going to work with a few different providers, like people like Amboss, people like Breeze that are interested in LSPs, and we're going to expand the API for Blocktank, and we're going to work with these people to establish, at least a recommended spec and standard for how people could make an API that is like compatible. And so we will deploy the API and Breeze will deploy the API and hopefully other people as well. But the idea here is that if everybody, uses this method, that they will be able to kind of make it easier to switch and be able to include multiple things. And so we want to make Blocktank something where it's much easier to list a channel for sale on Magma or list a channel for sale with liquidity ads. But we want to be sure about which set of things to support, because again, I'm more erring on the side of abstraction and letting people peer which methods and keeping the protocol as abstracted as possible than I am on supporting one specific thing. And so I'm not going to build an API specifically just to list channels on Magma. That doesn't make sense. But if Magma wants to have API connection through things and they care about this, then they should want to have the same API that we want to do to list things on Pool, and the same API that we want to do to list channels on as a liquidity ad in LN Router. Like all these things need to be interoperable because we don't know who's going to win. And so I think that until somebody makes a design that becomes popularized, that allows everybody to interoperate, I think it's better to abstract things and see if we can at least establish some sort of API standard.
Nice. Well, I think a question for you then, kind of as we start to wrap things up, because I think that idea makes a lot more sense. I think it's going to be more complicated, but the bigger problem that's solved, the more value typically that's given. So kudos to you guys for just the ambition there. This podcast really has its premise of Bitcoin on Lightning being able to bring more freedom and prosperity around the world and turn the tide from, let's say, authoritarianism, I should say that, Now, I think you're probably hopeful about that, but also one thing I've noticed about you is you're a very fair-minded individual. So maybe could you list some things you're hopeful for, where you potentially see that happening? Um, Also, some things
You
that
mean you mean the disruption of authoritarianism?
yes,
I think that we started there. When I said, that this whole design is to create an ecosystem that uproots, big banks, big tech, and big state. Like that, everything I do, everything we're doing, all of our designs are trying to do that. And so, if that's your bag, well, then we've got something for you. um, it will take us some time to deliver the ecosystem and all the parts of it. But that is the plan. The plan is to make it so you could entirely opt out of that system. Now, does the atomic economy solve violence? No. Like, I think that the best we can do, and my theory behind all of this is, if I can make it so everybody has everything they need, if they chose to actually focus on aligning incentives, and no matter how different those incentives are and how varied they may be, if they have some way of finding each of the people that agree with each other, finding each other, then maybe they could be the minimum amount of violence. If everybody can peer in their own webs of trust and organize over the things that they specifically care about and can have the tools to specifically define very abstract, totally different things. If people can find each other, people can align incentives, and we can decide who's cooperating, who's competing in the kind of optimal set. That's the idea behind the design. So I don't know if it will cure violence. I highly doubt it, but it could minimize it.
yeah, yeah, and it's not governance because as you noted on a recent Twitter.
Well, it's like I think governance is like in its ideal form for like what we talk about in Bitcoin and hyberbitcoinization and self-sovereignty. Governance is self-governance. It's like consensus is when I consent. And so as long as I'm always the one consenting, then that's the optimal government. That like, I get to decide my participation, whether I opt in or opt out of a situation. And if I'm always opting into something, then that's the optimal design for government governance. Like I can opt in as I choose. But if other people are making decisions for me that affect me, then that is, violence. And so at a very kind of, physics, metaphysical level, that's the problem. And I think it's probably more of a push and pull dynamic where we need a little of both at sometimes. And that's just the way it is. But the truth is, like, when you're cooperating with people, you are trusting them and you're able to do things you could never do alone. And when you're competing with people, you're trying to, either cooperate with two separate sets of people competing on something. But both things are very, very important to humanity. You need competition and you need cooperation. You need both. As long as we are always facilitating maximum competition and maximum cooperation, then we'll be okay. If we always go to cooperation, they'll end up being hierarchies of government and people who are enslaved. If we always go to, majority competition, there will always be war and there will always be violence. And so you can't really win. These are just the push and pull of physics, I guess.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it feels like Bitcoin and Lightning are a laboratory for this exact thing, figuring out.
Well, I think what Bitcoin does is by abstracting value, basically, you may have seen me say in some of my tweets that I think the most clear definition for Bitcoin is that it's a game. It's the most highly abstracted multiplayer, network game. And so it's like you have accounts and you have scores. And the only way you can increase your score is if somebody gives up some of their score. And that's it. And so this is like human nature, right? It's like if I cooperate and you want to give me some of your points, then I get more resources. If we compete, then I take your resources. In other words, you lose. So it's like it's a very abstracted way of kind of digitizing the evolution game, and the competition and cooperation concepts there, and it even expresses geographically, because you have to have a node, right? So you have to have a way of physically, placing this digital thing into the world. And so you end up having all the nodes acting as basically like almost like weather sensors. You know what I mean? So like when my node submits a transaction, that means that somebody did something to make me want to give up or receive more score, And so it is just a way of abstracting our value and abstracting our competition in our cooperation, I think. And so I think that that's why it's such a genius invention and such a useful tool, is it gave us finally a way to have the game be fairer.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, John, thanks so much for joining us today. When it comes to just people finding out about Synonym and about you, where can they go? Where should they go?
Sure. So for myself, my name on Twitter is Bitcoin Error Log. I'm also on Telegram. You can find me there if you want to chat. I have the podcast called The Biz, which is at thebiz.pro. This is a crowdfunded podcast. I'll be recording a new episode this month, and the current episode, I believe, is 99% or 100% full, possibly by now. I'm only doing one every few months because I don't have a lot of time to focus on promoting it and trying to get people to fill the crowd walls. But it's business oriented. The company is Synonym, and our website's at synonym.to, and our Twitter account is synonym_to, and we have Blocktank as our first product, and that's at blocktank.synonym.to. We'll be coming out with our mobile wallet later this year, probably still a few months away, but I'm really excited for that, and it will be probably the best demonstration of everything that we're trying to do. Yeah, and that's all I can think of at the moment.
One last question. Where did Bitcoin Error Log come from?
So as you may have noticed, I like correcting people. And I like, pointing out like some people call me negative, but I don't think I'm being negative so much as having I don't know, too high standards or something. I don't know the best way to put it. I'm not going to psychoanalyze myself here, but I do like to point out when somebody has a misconception about something, and I was pointing out people's errors with Bitcoin, and so that's where I got the name. And so I was just decided I would call myself Bitcoin Error Log. There's also a little bit of a joke because I think that Bitcoin actually doesn't have an error log as far as this being a normal function in applications, and so I'm the Bitcoin Error Log. I tell you when you're wrong about Bitcoin. That's the joke of the name.
I love it. It kind of reminds me of Rusty from Core Lightning, his shit Bitcoiners say, and how
he's surprisingly he's a little more aggressive than I am. But yeah, I am familiar with the account.
Awesome. All right, thanks, John.
Thank you.
That was a fantastic and fascinating conversation. So much there. More than identity, decentralized identity was kind of how we started out the conversation. And Slashtags is much more than that. I mean, the ability to abstract your web of trust, your payment, the people who are in your web of trust, their payment methods using Slashpay. And then beyond that, becoming an LSP and trying to create a standard overall. And that to me is probably the most fascinating piece of this, is the idea of abstracting all of those things into your particular web of trust for who you trust and want to cooperate with. And then beyond that, creating this interoperable set of standards, as Bitcoin and Lightning grows and more people build on it. To his point about the cartoon of like too many standards, let's create one more. But the idea of being able to bring people together who are using different payment standards, whether that's on the Bitcoin blockchain, legacy SegWit, native SegWit, Taproot, and then on the Lightning network, the different standards of Bolt 12 versus Bolt 11 and AMP. And so that, to me, being able to create that standard on the payment side, but then also a standard amongst LSPs, that is game changing. And afterwards, John and I talked after the episode offline, but he mentioned Block as being probably the only company that has the same level of ambition across a breadth of just entry points into Bitcoin and Lightning. And so it'll be interesting to see how a publicly traded company like Block and a open source startup, Bitcoin only, it'll be interesting to see what that competition looks like, and who will win, or will we merge all into one specific standard, merge into a highly cooperative, or is it going to be a competitive bloodbath? Who knows? But that's part of what makes the game really fun. And speaking of the game, that last part is probably a must for anyone who has been following Bitcoin for a while. I think that particular analogy, John makes fun of analogies quite a bit, but I think that particular one is really fascinating. So, hey, just wanted to shout out a couple people on Fountain. Had at DP on Fountain send about 1,000 sats to session 19 with Becoming Phil of Landifa Bitcoin. Glad that brought you some value. I loved that episode, and honestly, loved it. I think Becoming Phil is super ambitious down there and doing some awesome stuff. And so that was a recent support of the show. So thanks for those 1,000 sats. If you do like the show, please like, subscribe, send a boostergram via Fountain, and help out the show. There's no ads, but I really do desire to talk with people who are building in the Bitcoin and Lightning space and doing it to advance freedom, prosperity, and against authoritarianism out there using Bitcoin and Lightning. So looking forward to the next one. Until then, go stack some sats while they're cheap.